This story starts like many others. You pack your bags, get on a flight, and pick up a car. On this trip, we would drive over 6,000 kilometers, visit 4 countries, and get 14 stamps in our passports. As we landed in Windhoek, Namibia, we had to drive over 10 hours to get to Mount Botswana. The rain season was about to start, so we planned our visit to Botswana first. The Okavango Delta will change from a dry land into a wetland, which would make it really difficult for us to visit. Luckily, the weather was in our favor. We had long days with warm summer nights. The next day we would drive from Mount to Sakanaka, a 137 kilometer drive. We were surprised by the time of Google. It said it would take us 3.5 hours to get there. After an hour of driving, the road would change from asphalt to sand, and we started to realize why it would take us so long. We also understood why you needed a 4-wheel drive. The sand was pretty soft and challenging to drive on. But even before entering the Okavango Delta at Southgate, we saw plenty of animals and driving really slowly. In the end, it took us over 6 hours to get to Sakanaka campsite. We set up camp for the night, took it slow, a bit too slow. It was already getting dark when we finished our dinner. All of a sudden, lions started to roar. We could definitely hear them, they were nearby. We had to finish what we were doing and get inside our tent. The next morning we got up really early. As animals would be most active, it would be easiest to spot them. But first we found some lion prints in our campsite, so we were really curious to find those majestic animals. We drove around all morning on small sandy seasonal roads. It was a true safari. We found plenty of animals. As it got closer to noon, it started to heat up pretty quickly. We couldn't find those lions, so we drove back. And guess what? They were next to our camp. What a day! And that wasn't even all the action. At dinner time, a bird came along and he tried to steal our freshly cooked steaks. The next morning, we would leave the Moremi Game Reserve. We would go through Northgate and then be off to Mount. After Mount to Naipan, a salt pan which is really dry and barren. It took us over 5 hours to get to Mount, but it didn't matter as we took a big detour and we saw plenty of animals on the way out. When we finally reached Naipan itself, we went straight to the waterhole as it's very dry and very hot. All the animals would be located there. Of course we were too slow again and we had to rush to our campsite for dinner. All of a sudden, the bushes started to move, and the jackal came along. He wanted some dinner too. After a good night's rest, we would do a morning safari and then be off to Zimbabwe. After our safari, we would go to Pandametenga, a very small border post between Botswana and Zimbabwe. We were the first car to cross that border that day. And also the last. The border post was about to close. The immigration officer at the Botswana side asked if we arranged everything for our entry into Zimbabwe. We said no. She smiled. And boy, was she right. We had to pay for our double entry visa. We had to pay for our car. And also, because it was a rental car, we had to pay some more. Eventually, this border alone cost us over 200 euros. Zimbabwe would be the most expensive country we would visit this trip. Everything is super overpriced for tourists. But hey, we were at the famous Victoria waterfalls. We would cross into Zambia first by foot, and then re-enter Zimbabwe. That's why we needed that double visa. The Zambian side is much cheaper to view, but not as impressive as the Zimbabwe side, so definitely check both sides out. We were visiting at the beginning of the rain season, so the water levels would be at their lowest. With those low water levels, there are plenty of activities possible. Unfortunately, we didn't have any time to do any. Enjoy some aerial shots of the famous Victoria waterfalls. It's time to get back in the car again and drive back to Botswana, as we will be visiting Chobe. The famous Chobe River runs along the border of Botswana. There are plenty of animals to be seen there. First we would visit Ihaha campsites, which are located right next to the river. You have to go through Sedudu Gate, which is near Kasane. We completely missed the entry gate, so we arrived late, but we did spot more lions and also plenty of animals which we didn't see before. From Ihaha we went to Lianti, a big detour of 6 hours. We thought it was worth it, but at the end it wasn't, and we got stuck with the car. Luckily we were rescued by the army. So let's move on to Namibia. Namibia is a much drier country than Botswana. It's mainly desert with a lot of sand. But in the far right corner there's the Caprivi Strip. It's like Botswana with a lot of wetlands. Our next stop would be Etosha National Park. Although Etosha is very big, it's also fenced off. We didn't really enjoy it that much. You can drive 60 kilometers per hour on perfect roads from waterhole to waterhole to see the animals. That's more like a zoo than a true safari. Visiting Etosha is much cheaper than visiting any national park in Botswana, so we would still recommend to put it on your itinerary. It's time to move to the next stop, the Skeleton Coast. We had booked a seasonal campsite right on the beach at Tora Bay. Sleeping under the stars near the ocean. Sounds cool, right? In the end it turned out to be a bit of a disappointment. The beach wasn't all that impressive, and it also was pretty cold and foggy. Eventually we turned around and left the Skeleton Coast behind us to go back where we came from. Yeah, that's right, we turned around back to Damaraland. As most parts of Namibia are fenced off, we were super lucky to spot this desert giraffe. We saw some cool stops on the way to Skeleton Coast. Now we had some time to visit them, like the UNESCO heritage site with the rock engravings. It's definitely worth a visit, the rock engravings in Twijfelfontein. You will have to go with a guide, but it's well worth it. From Twijfelfontein we would go to the White Lady painting. You can find those drawings in the Brandberg area. On our way there we saw many people asking for water and food. We gave them all our water and food, so we had to restock in Wies. Damaraland is super far from society, but it's super awesome to visit. It's really authentic and the people there are super friendly. Make sure to bring plenty of food and water, and also fuel, because Damaraland is really desolate. We had an amazing campsite for the night in Wies, and we were lucky enough to see some shooting stars. It's time for some action. We are going from Wies to Walvis Bay. In Walvis Bay we'll be visiting June 7 and also be kitesurfing, finally hitting the water. June 7, the highest dune on the African continent. Of course we had to pay to climb it, but we were sitting in the car for the past 2 weeks. It didn't take us long to get up there, so was it worth the money? Not really. The view wasn't all that great, and we were going to Sossusvlei, where you can climb a lot of sand dunes with probably better views. So if you're in the area, you could do it, but we were going straight for the water. Unfortunately, I got injured just before a holiday, so I couldn't kite a lot. Luckily, the wind picked up in the afternoon, so we could go for a session. First, we went to the kite school to get some information. The landing and launching area at the kite school was quite difficult, so we chose to go for a different spot. Landing and launching was a lot safer here, and that's also where the kite school teaches. The wind was around 25 knots, so perfect weather to pump up the night. The spot was alright. The wind was a bit gusty and the water was a bit choppy. Downwind was a speed spot, but we didn't feel like going there. The next morning we would drive off to Sossusvlei, so we were going for a good night's rest and a short session. We are on the road again from Walvis Bay to Sossusvlei. We'd already seen a lot, so we didn't have many expectations for this route. Eventually it turned out to be a very cool drive, with the landscape changing every now and then, from a desert landscape to a mountain landscape and back. It was our last night before going back to Windhoek, so we stayed in a fancy place, right next to the gates of the Sossusvlei, so in the morning we could access the gates early and be one of the first in Sossus. Although being the fifth car to access the gates in the morning, there was still a lot of people before us on the Sossusvlei. If you sleep within the gates, you are allowed to drive around before sunrise. Otherwise, you will have to wait before the sun rises to go inside. Our first stop would be the Dead Fly. It's very Insta famous, so the expectations were pretty high. When we arrived, we were like, it's quite small and nothing like the pictures. But hey, we were there, so we better enjoy it. After taking some pictures, like thousands of tourists, we had to get away from the crowds. We drove all the way to the end to get to a dune called Big Mama. We decided to climb it. And it was so much better than that fly. There was nobody and the views were amazing. So you can skip June 7 in Walvis Bay if you're going here. It's the end of our trip. We are going back to Windhoek. It were 3 amazing weeks, with Botswana as the true highlight of this trip. Botswana is much more expensive than Namibia, but it's also more wild. This was exactly what we were looking for. I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and until the next.